Hello and welcome back to That Age 12. It's this monthly live stream, and this week we are joined by Lindsay Powell, and we are discussing Julio-Claudian History. And last time he was on, we actually made a two-part series on this topic. So if there's anything we may have missed out on here, I would recommend you go to check out our two-part series. I think it was last year, actually. I think it's been a year already. It's
Is
crazy.
it really? Wow.
I think so.
Okay.
It's amazing how fast time flies. This
Yep.
week we are doing I'm going to try to make some monthly live stream. And right now we don't have any viewers on, but it's people can always go back to watch this afterwards, of course, because it will still be there after this has been live. So welcome to those of who choose to join in the future, and hopefully there will be one or two people on here eventually. Now, let's begin. I know you don't want to say much on this. Let's just begin to keep the conversation going. And we just want to treat this for now as a normal podcast episode. Let's begin discussing, because there's been, in my understanding, some academics feel like history and not just Roman history, but general history, because they, I have a degree and I have a PhD or a professorship, I'm entitled, or history should be exclusive, and they've kind of frowned upon public history and work like such as maybe your own books on like work of Tom Holland, or not Spider-Man Tom Holland, mind you, but also work like Mary Bird or Tom Holland or other works that have fantastic work. But what are your thoughts on this? That some historians feel like history should be exclusive. I find it ridiculous, because there's obviously such a vast interest in Roman history in general of the public that don't have, even though those who don't have PhD or the professorship in this, there's obviously a vast interest, and there was a whole meme about this last year. And what are your thoughts on this in general, of those who feel like it should be those professors or historians, scholars who feel like this should be just an exclusive field?
Well, thank you first of all for letting me come on the show. I always enjoy being with you, Erlend. It's wonderful to be with someone who has someone who is so well read and so passionate about history, and you read it in English as a second language. So I take my hat off to you. It's a tricky subject.
You have Latin as a second language, so hats off to you.
Well, German and French, actually, and Welsh somewhere in my background. So look, I think that the crux of the matter is, what do we mean by historian? And I did do a little bit of research on this, and I think that the definition effectively comes down to someone who studies critically and publishes on history. So that's quite a wide definition. It's quite a wide category. It allows a lot of people to come into the space. I have to tell you, as an historian, I respect totally the work of academics. I rely on the work of academics. I understand that academics don't always agree with each other, and I think that's one of the wonderful things about studying history. There are different ways to look at it. And it's an evolving subject. There's an idea somehow that history is fixed and is unchanging, which, interesting enough, as the news editor for both Ancient History magazine and Ancient Warfare magazine, I get to see lots of press releases and stories coming out of archaeological digs, research papers coming out from different universities, and each one is shedding new light on a subject that we all thought was safe and secure, was locked down. So I think there's room for lots of perspectives. Now, as to do historians, and you're referring specifically to people at universities and higher institutes of education, do they have somehow a monopoly of the knowledge? No, I don't think they have the monopoly of the knowledge. What they have is the professional skill set to critically examine what they're looking at. They can apply different techniques. If it's, for example, classicists look at texts. Other people, for example, like papyrologists, will read texts in forms of surviving papyri and documents of that nature. There are epigraphists who study engravings on inscriptions. There are people who study statuary. There's lots of different areas, and my particular area of focus is military history and the biographies of the Julio-Claudian family, which is what we're here to talk about. And I repeat the point, I rely greatly on the work that academic historians do. Now, adding to that, I think it was something that came out recently in the International Conference on Ancient Warfare, which was jointly between Austria and Chicago, Illinois, was the recognition that to open up the dialogue, to free it from the constraints of a university, a lot of academics now welcome other kinds of discussion, so that they, for example, and you happen to mention, for example, like Tom Holland, there's Barry Strauss, there's Adrian Goldsworthy, top-notch historians who write for a general reader, but they come from a sound academic background. So I think that there is space for moving the discussion, which can be very, very minutiae detailed. It can be very, very grounded in really quite solid research. It can be statistical because people are counting gravestones. It can be the use of a particular word in a poem or a piece of literature from which they're trying to extract some general observation. That can be lost on the greater public. The people who are interested in history go, what do we need to know about the use of dative in the speeches of Cicero, for example? But they are very interested to know about Cicero the man and how he lived his life under those circumstances. And that's why I think you've mentioned Tom Holland, do the industry a service by actually making that accessible to a wider range of people. And then they can go and research academic books and papers. And I want to pay homage to two services I use as a historian myself. One is journal storage, known as jstore.org. I basically spent hours there a week looking for papers, reading things. It's just a wonderful repository of published knowledge going back a very, very long time. And then the other was academia, which is another place where scholars put their work, articles, papers, basically free of charge. And that enables me to gather a lot of information and read contrasting points of view. And like I said, historians don't always agree on things. And that's part of, for me, the fascination of the whole thing. And along can come an archaeologist and say, hey, I found this thing. It's not supposed to be here, but I just dug it out of the ground. And that can have quite serious repercussions. So I get where you're coming from. I'm more respectful to the academics, but I also understand that they know that there's a greater public out there that have a thirst and a hunger to be kept up to date in language they can understand.
And I find it interesting too that some academics, because we discussed this earlier today off the record, that there are some this tweet that went kind of viral a while ago, a few months ago now, I think. It's kind of it's the internet, so people forget real fast. But I'm bringing it up because I do want to make an episode about this in the future, about how Roman history should not be exclusive in the way that we're talking about right now. But it's a lot of historians where he recommended books such as Mary Bird's work, SPQR, or Tom Holland's Dynasty, and etc. And people and the serious academics kind of were making fun of this post in a way. And I thought, to be honest, I thought we were past this right now. That it's 2024. That people should be. Oh, there's a vast interest in this, and it's ridiculous that people kind of thought that. I find it a bit ridiculous that people, academics, feel like these are just I don't know the term for it, but that these books are.
Are you thinking of the word condescension?
Maybe that's the word, yeah, condescension. And people don't expect people who have not read a single word about Rome to begin go on Cicero or Polybius or Pliny or others of Plutarch right away. They need somewhere to start, and those books are. For me, my first book on Rome was What was here? It was a BBC book on the history of Rome. I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about. I don't remember the name of the author, but it was a BBC book on, and it was an entire survey of the Roman Empire. And I don't remember the name of the book right now. I'm sure if someone listening later, they might know which one I'm talking about. But that was an excellent introduction for me to
Mm-hmm.
the Roman Empire and the Roman history of the Roman world. And oh wait, it did not end. Roman Empire did not end in 467, as mainstream people think. It's ended much later, which is another entire field of study.
Yeah. So I think
I think we need those books, to have to actually have an intro. They work well as an introduction, and then you can later on go read, say, Polybius, which is a fantastic read. It really feels like you read a modern history book when you read Polybius, but our Plutarch or other works such as the ancient historians, or even more academic work, like you said, of the era. And believe me, I read a few academic works, and they can be daunting, but they are well worth it.
But I think the people who are doing academic work are they're charged with doing research, and if they're doing PhDs, they're trying to push the envelope of knowledge, right? So by definition, they're exploring new aspects of maybe accepted ideas or just new things, and of course they have to work to strictures of academic process. So they have to be mindful of sources and critically thinking about things, assessing previous research. So a lot of what they do, in fact, will be a literature survey where they're looking back at what's already been written, and then they define the areas that they're looking at, and then they will bring in the knowledge, the findings that they have. Now, for example, a lot of those people are now discovering, and actually universities are encouraging, a much broader view of how academic research is actually engaging to ordinary people. And don't forget, in some countries, the universities are funded by taxpayers. So they obviously need the goodwill of the taxpayers to keep their academic research going. So there's that aspect too. So you'll find that there are online courses now which universities run, and they are extremely well done in most cases. I mean, I did, for example, several of the Future Learn courses. There was one, for example, about Roman medical science. There was one about research being done at Portus and Ostia by University of Southampton, which I thought was exceptionally well done. And there were all sorts of different things of that nature. And then on top of that, you've got a wealth of magazines now. I mean, I've mentioned two that I write for, and I think they have to be some of the best in the industry. But there's BBC History. There are plenty of other magazines which deal with not just the period that I'm interested in, but a whole wealth of things. And what's surprising is how good the writers of those articles are, many of whom are academics. And part of their impact, I think is the expression that universities use, is also the number of those articles that they publish in mainstream publications. So it's not just in very, very well regarded academic journals which come out maybe once or four times a year, but quarterly and monthly magazines also are now beginning to gain traction, because the mission here is to get people excited and question history. And if you just restrict it to the dusty libraries of academe, you run the risk of actually making that discussion very, very narrow. And actually other voices will come into that space and actually start corrupting the insights. And we live in a time where people are not always aware of the sources underpinning things they read on the internet. You mentioned that earlier, and that can be very dangerous. So what we want people to do is maintain their curiosity, and we encourage them to go to people who, you can call them experts. Historians don't have to have PhDs, in my opinion, but they do have to have a very good knowledge of the subject they're writing about. And in that case, it might well be that they're studying original documents, or they are studying interpretations of those. And a lot of what historians do is, of course, is synthesizing insights that other people have gathered, and then they sometimes question them because archaeological information has come along, a new tombstone's been found. So I'm thinking one of the tropes of archaeology and Roman history was that after Teutoburg, nothing ever happened. And before that, the Romans weren't really making much progress in Germany. So two things. One was a Roman-ish looking town called Waldgerimus in the Lahn Valley, which dendrochronology, I think, set that they looked at the wooden tree trunks that had been embedded in the ground, and I think there are other dates to 8 or 4 BC. And people are saying, whoa, gosh, there's obtuse references to that in Cassis Dio. But actually, this is the first archaeological evidence of something that looks like a town in a sort of Roman style with sort of squarish profile and ditches and so on. And then on the other side, after Teutoburg, the Romans aren't supposed to be in Germany, at a place called Hartshorn, it turns out that there, in fact, is trace of a battle in sometime around about, I think it's 236, 235 AD. So that's something like 225 years later. So what these insights get people to go back to is to question the fundamentals of our knowledge and our understanding. Can we really trust the classical sources? And it's very easy for people to, oh, well, it's in Tacitus, it therefore must be true. Oh no, don't trust Suetonius.
His book Germania comes to mind.
Yeah.
Saying.
Yes, but the point is, what's also interesting about that is, for example, if you take Tacitus, the Annals, there is the famous trial in that of Calpurnius Piso, who is the man accused of sedition, insurrection, and also the poisoning of Germanicus. We talked about that in another podcast. What's very interesting is that there's a long piece in I think it's book 4 or 5, something like that. It's an event that takes place in AD 20, I think, if I recall, in something like December. It takes place in the Senate, and the Senate make a decision. In the meantime, Calpurnius Piso is found dead. The assumption is suicide. Other people are thinking he actually was bumped off. But here's the funny thing. So Tacitus gives us the summary of what the Senate decided to do. And it decided to, for example, damn the name of Calpurnius Piso. Yes, he was found guilty of sedition. They couldn't come to a conclusion on whether Germanicus was poisoned or not. They said that his name should be struck out and all sorts of other things. What we found in Spain, interesting enough, are fragments which can be put together of it's called Tabula Sierensis. And what's in this is the statement from the Senate verbatim. It's the decree. It's not the Sierensis. It's the Senatus Consultum Calpurnius Piso Patre. That's what it's called. SCPP for short. Now we actually have a real document as approved by the Senate in that year by the voting members who actually voted for his posthumous guilty verdict. And we can compare that to Tacitus now. And what's remarkable is how most of the time Tacitus is faithful, is true to that document. He biases it slightly, he includes a few things, he takes a few things out. But it's not much different than someone reporting in a magazine or in a newspaper today. So I think what that gives you is more confidence that actually maybe Tacitus is telling more of the truth than not. But we can understand he has a literary and a philosophical vantage point, and he's writing a sort of moralistic history for people of his time, which is around about Trajan's time. So, that's 100 years on, almost, maybe something like 80 years on from the events he's reporting. So again, these insights come from reading the documents originally or reading other people's reading of those documents. And on my bookshelf behind me, I have at least 2 books on the SCPP because I found them absolutely fascinating. So what I'm saying to you is we need academics, but we need academics to also welcome in people who are more generalists. They are responding by actually becoming generalists in their own way. And I talk about, for example, we mentioned Barry Strauss, a man I greatly respect, formerly from Cornell. And he has made a great space in the market for these books by writing about the Battle of Salamis, for example, about the Battle of Actium and plenty of other things with an academic's precision, but in language that the regular reader can work. And that's the standard I also work to. I try to be meticulous in my research. So when you look at my books, something like 15% of the book is notes.
We talked about this the last time, I think. Your book Tiberius took ages have taken or taking ages to write because you were so particulate. Sorry, not peculiar, but particulate.
Yeah.
With the research, and you told. I remember you said you used 1 year to just write one chapter because it was so difficult to find the sources for and compare and to put all things together for that one chapter.
That was exceptional, and that particularly was my book on Tiberius, which is now going through production. It should come out in March. And what I was frustrated about that was I began to realize that the perception that we in the 21st century have of Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome, is really shaped by the previous 1500 years, not so much the years of his own reign, which were basically 14 to 37 AD. So he was a Roman emperor for something like 22 years. He was about 77 when he died. So he had 54 or something years.
That's quite good for a Roman emperor.
Yes, he was. I think he was about the 8th longest serving. He lived longer than Augustus, which is quite remarkable. There's questions exactly how he died, whether it was natural. I think it was natural, or whether he was smothered and poisoned. That I try to cover in the book, because there's already a mythology, even in his own time, in the immediate weeks and months afterwards. So Josephus and Seneca tell a slightly different story than some other sources, and then you get into how was the post-mortem story about this man written? And I discovered, for example, the early Christians really liked Tiberius. That was a surprise to me. The early Christian historians liked Tiberius, and the reason is because the reason is this: it was under him that the man who became the Christ happened under his reign. And he didn't do anything particularly much to harm the Christians, as it turns out. In fact, there is a sort of tradition that when the Christians approached Tiberius and say, "Would you please make Christ, Christos, as he's called in the early texts, a god?" they had a sympathetic ear with Tiberius. And in fact, the story goes that he presented it as an issue to the Senate, and the Senate said, "Well, basically, that's not any of your concern. It's our remit to do that." And he pushed the case over and over. He was not successful finally, but it's in 3 sources, not pagan Roman sources, but Christian Roman sources, that this story is told. They also, by the way, don't find Pilate a particularly bad man, because, of course, he was the person who enacted the sentence for sedition, which was crucifixion. And without the crucifixion, there could be no Christ story, because there couldn't be a resurrection. So you see how those sorts of things are in. Philo, the Jewish philosopher, ambassador to the court of Caius, we know as Caligula, actually praised Tiberius. Josephus had some sort of negative sort of things to say, but there were some good things about it. It's when you get to the likes of Tacitus and Suetonius and Cassius Dio, then you see this really, really quite stark negative portrayal of the man. And there's some speculation that between the first historians and those 3, and in the meantime, we've also got Velleius Paterculus, who died slightly before Tiberius himself died. There was another book that's now lost, which was actually quite anti-Tiberius, and that's the source that the other 3 use. Now, we don't know that, because that book doesn't survive. It's a hypothesis. And the thing that took me a year to get my ideas around was to look at, for example, in the 17th, 18th centuries, the French stage in Paris particularly were writing lots of plays, 5-act plays about Tibère à Capri. And they were actually talking about how he was a sort of representative of a tyrannical king. Guess why? Because they were talking about the king in Versailles. And in fact, he became a shorthand as a sort of a straw man, that they could say, look what tyranny and evil does when a man has absolute power. They were able to weave in all sorts of interesting stories in there. Again, there's a Christian that's involved trying to cure him and so on. And then after the introduction of the French Republic, and that doesn't go so well in its earliest stage, writers then go back to Tiberius to show other aspects, because he becomes a person through whom they can tell the story of when the populists run things without proper sort of guidance. And that was really interesting to me, because in fact, if you look all the way through to I, Claudius, which was the Robert Graves book, Alan Massey wrote I think one of the best historical fiction books. It's called Tiberius, where he imagines that Tiberius, we know he wrote a biography, it doesn't survive, but he comes up with, what if it did survive? What would it tell us? So he wrote it. So Alan Massey wrote this biography, and it's really wonderful. I think he came very close to describing the man in fictional terms, which I've struggled with as a non-fiction biographer. And that's the other thing, by the way, is I'm going off an adjacent subject here. Some people arrive at history through fiction. And that's fine. Other people arrive at it through the movies, through films and documentaries. But I think there's sometimes a temptation to not want to inquire beyond the fiction. So one thing that annoys me is the fact that some book lists, particularly on Amazon, they just have like top 100 bestsellers in history. And it's a muddle. Some of it's fiction, some of it's philosophy, some of it's nonfiction. The point is, I think they need a better definition. I'm absolutely not negating the value of fiction. I think fiction is a wonderful medium to explore issues that people face, to make those human to us in a way that it's harder for a nonfiction, a biographer like me. I have to stick to the known facts. And even those facts are filtered through people like we mentioned, Suetonius, Tacitus, and others. And the result is that a really good historical fiction writer is like an historian. Actually, they're using the same material that I do. They're facing the same issues, like, well, why did that person do that, not the other thing? And what they do is, in a fictional way, they try to bridge the gaps. And sometimes they do it fascinatingly well. I think, is it John Williams wrote the book about Augustus? And I listened to the audiobook of that. It really is a classic novel. And it's seen through the eyes of Augustus at the end of his life, if I recall, and he goes through episodes in his life, and he's talking to, for example, Marcus Agrippa, someone I wrote a book about, and it was
an episode about, coincidentally.
Yes, and again, it's a fictional telling of facts, and there are some liberties taken with it. And I think as long as somebody reading that book understands that it is not history, it is an interpretation of history. It's well served. I mean, I welcome all of these voices in the historical narrative. I think that just people need to be aware that sometimes they make stuff up.
Sorry to interrupt you, but to use one example, for example, Shakespeare, for example, he used Plutarch, especially for his Antony and Cleopatra and Caesar, I think, for his plays. So he... Again, you have some, and I made an episode about Cleopatra as well a while ago, over a year ago now, and we discussed that it's almost a little bit, it's fairly accurate. Shakespeare's as it turned out, it's just those mumbo jumbo that Shakespeare write. It's some truth to it, and of course Plutarch is somewhat, of course, not entirely reliable. But Plutarch was a major inspiration to his antique plays that Shakespeare wrote.
Oh, yes. And what was interesting from a dramatist's point of view in the English 17th century, I mean, he was operating under certain restrictions. If I recall, he was a Catholic, and of course he had a Protestant queen, and then into King James and so on. And they kind of regulated what could and couldn't be said. So some of Shakespeare's plays are just entertainments. Other ones are subtle.
Facts in there.
Oh yes, but my point is, I think, again, like the French playwrights of the 17th and 18th century I was talking about earlier with regard to Tiberius, it was also a way maybe for him to have a critical assessment of his own day. So you could actually argue that, for example, Julius Caesar, it deals with the issue of tyranny. And absolutely it's based on Plutarch, who actually is a pretty good biographer. He actually wrote a biography of Tiberius. It's gone. We know the ones he wrote because he wrote the Gracchi, so we have that. And what's very interesting is I actually used extracts of Plutarch in my books about Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. And of course, Cleopatra came out very bad because, again, under Augustan propaganda, she was the enemy. Yeah, she's an enemy. So there's a trope about powerful women. The Romans really don't particularly like that. But also part of the Augustan mythology in the two big events, which of course are Actium and also the fall of Alexandria the year after. So we're talking 3130 BC, is really to haul her up as an example of someone who was fundamentally trying to hit the Roman Empire with a wrecking ball. But it suited him because, I mean, to try and make Marcus Antonius, the enemy, still was not a very comfortable place to be, because he didn't want it to be a war about a fellow Roman citizen, a civil war. It was a foreign war. It was a war foisted on them because a wicked woman, a queen of a foreign country, had actually taken over the mind and made driven mad Marcus Antonius, who was specifically, it was supposed to be the consul. It was just very convenient to have her as the person you could throw darts at, and Plutarch was part of that manufacturing of the story.
So, speaking of anti-Tiberiusness, to put it that way, I want to discuss as well, should the anti-Tiberius feel why we get later on, should it be Flavian propaganda in a way? Because, when the Flavians came to the throne, they wanted to prove that they were better than the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And quite frankly, you can't really blame them. You have leaders such as Nero or Caligula, but and of course, as we will see in your biography, how was Tiberius really, and we will discuss this later on in this episode, in this live stream, was Tiberius really this sex maniac and orgy kind of guy? We did touch on this in our episode on the Julio-Claudian dynasty as well, but is this mostly anti-Julio-Claudian dynasty propaganda from the Flavians?
As always, you ask really good questions. That's why you're very good at this. So here's the thing, right? I think at some level you're right. When in 68-69 that civil war broke out, and eventually the Flavians, Titus Vespasianus, the father, is able to overthrow the other people who are in that year. So that's Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian wins. Yes, there is a certain element there of putting a full stop, a dividing wall between everything that had gone before and this new regime. And of course, their story was based on the capture of Judea. And of course, their whole coin system is Judaea Capta. And this is the sort of line that they get. So they're repealing once again to people taking control and living sort of, a proper Roman life, and what you see in the portraiture is very definitely, these stern-looking people, no-nonsense people, and good Italian stock. Now, the interesting thing is that Vespasian, I think he rules for like 10 years, doesn't he? Something like that. And then his son comes along, and he rules for not very many years. Along comes his brother afterwards. And guess what he likes to read? He likes to read the memoirs of Tiberius. That's preserved in Suetonius, by the way. So what's interesting also is that the Flavians issued what I think they call a reissue money, which is to say that they would have in the copper coins, the Dupondii and the Sestercii and the Ice, the low-value coins minted in Rome. They often would issue like Rome's greatest emperors, so that they would actually have one of Augustus, they'd have, and Tiberius is amongst the series, Claudius, I think, is another, and they will actually reproduce literally from, I think, either a copy of the die, the original one, and then they literally, around the edge of it, then sort of put the name of the Flavian emperor around the side of it. So what they're basically saying is that we're legitimate because we're part of a continuity, which means that they may well be considered to be usurpers, but they're the right kind of usurpers. They got their fair and square. They reestablished, law and order after, a crazy guy. In this case, that will be Nero, but also the other people in between who were sort of part of his court, Galba, Otho, Vitellius. So what they're doing is not only are they making a mythology for themselves by pointing to the foibles and the weaknesses of the Julio-Claudians, but at another level, they need them to be able to say, we're a continuity. That's how we can be what historians call the principate. It comes from princeps, being basically first, in the sense of like first among equals is how people often describe primus inter pares. But it really is like the head of the Senate, princeps senatus. So in order to be able to show that they are legit, going all the way back to Augustus, who generally is thought to be a good man, despite him being opaque in lots of ways and sometimes inexplicable. It turns out that Domitian, who was one of the more unpopular names of the Flavian family, and by the way, the last of the three, he was actually reading for entertainment and information how Tiberius ran affairs.
The next topic I want to talk a little bit about is some of the women of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. I want to bring up especially Agrippina the Younger.
Mm.
Sorry, yeah, I think she's the younger. The one who Nero's mother. That's the young. I believe that's the
Correct.
younger. Yeah.
Yes.
So, again, because she is kind of demonized in a way
Hmm.
in history as this power hungry, and she
Hmm.
supposedly poisoned Claudius, and she, makes Nero son, and then Nero tried to kill her, etc., etc. She tried to be the power behind the throne, but again, it's come to my last question: is this again Flavian propaganda, and how much do we know? Was she really this power hungry woman behind the throne, or could I mean I no doubt that because most historians seem to agree on this that she did Nero did try to kill her, and she kind of so I'm not sure when he did, but how much of this that she was this bad woman who couldn't keep her pants together, to put for the lack of better words, and how much of this is true, and do we know if was she really like how history portrays her?
So you ask an important question there, which is how much of this is true. And here's the fundamental problem with the history of the ancient world. We're relying primarily on written documents, which have come to us through very circuitous routes, have been copied and sometimes edited. Sometimes whole bits are missing. Maybe words in the copying were miswritten down. And of course, we have to sometimes interpret the language, because sometimes the language is a little bit obscure.
And you have to
Um,
really read between the lines as well.
yes, well, that too. But specifically to your point, I think what's important, we're talking about the daughter of Germanicus, who had quite a large family. So she was one of several in the family. The other ones being, for example, he had Nero Caesar, Drusus Caesar. There were two boys, Tiberius and another Caius. They died basically within a year or two. Then there's Caius Caesar that we know as Caligula. There was an unnamed daughter who also died, so that's 3 deaths amongst the kids. There was a Drusilla, and then there's Julia Livilla. So you can see it's a very big family they come from. And Germanicus is very popular. It just seems to be that her association, she was married 3 times, if you remember. She was married to Cneius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who was, I don't think, a very particularly pleasant man from what I gather. As a Roman of the very old sort, but with a bit of a bully and a not terribly good company if you were on the wrong side of him. And it was through him that she had the son that they called Nero. And she went on to marry Passienus Crispus and then finally Claudius, which of course was arguably an incestuous marriage, because she in fact was his niece. So you can see that there's a lot of things going on there. Big family, several marriages.
That wasn't quite entirely uncommon in that age up until the modern times, though. Unless you're in Alabama today, it's still not uncommon.
Well, yes, and to the latter part about marrying nieces, by the way, when I was doing the research for my book on Queen Cleopatra, what was shocking to me was the extent to which incestuous marriages were permitted throughout Egyptian society. An estimate, I think, is 1/5 of marriages in Egypt were incestuous at some level. So that's quite a surprise when you come out. So maybe they didn't understand the biological risks that went with that, but the point is it was a cultural phenomenon. And I don't know that the Romans thought that Claudius marrying his niece was a terribly good politics, but he made that decision. So there you are. And he made the decision to adopt the son and give him the name and actually prefer him over his own son, Britannicus. And I think you might have covered that. I think you talked to Anthony Barrett, another historian I greatly respect. So what you've got is a number of factors going on here. The historians that we get this information from are really writing after she's dead. I understand that I think she wrote a biography, and those historians were able to read it. And I think maybe in the case of who is it now? Is it Tacitus or is it Suetonius that quotes lines or so from there?
Don't ask me, mate.
Okay. So the point is, the document doesn't survive, but we know that it existed and we know that it was a source. And then again, so were the people copying it and reporting it being faithful to what was written? Of course, if she's writing it like any celebrity writing a biography today, that's their version of history, right? And it may not be objective as a result of that, but it is an opinion. It's seen through their eyes, and we don't have it. As in fact, I think the only document that, quite frankly, that we have from Roman times, which is through the eyes of the writers, Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War and Civil War, and even then he writes as the third person, which is sort of slightly bizarre approach that he took, but it is what it is. So what you have with her is that the great Roman suspicion of women and power, because basically they're not supposed to be involved in power at pretty much any level. On the other hand, we know that, for example, the Augustus's wife, Livia Drusilla, clearly was involved at some level in making policy decisions with her husband. The husband obviously did the public side of it, but they must have had conversations around the dinner table and so on. And she had an entourage of her own. She had followers. Of course, Calpurnius Piso's wife, in fact, appealed to her for help in 1920 AD while she saw her husband's life falling apart in the Senate. So she wanted to get the protection of her. And again, we come back to Tiberius, where there's allegedly a very fractious relationship between mother and son. I'm not so sure that that's actually what the evidence that we've got in the written sources necessarily support. I mean, mothers and sons, right? I mean, we all have days when things get a little bit fractious. But at the end of the day, he respected his mother. When she fell ill, he rushed to be with her, thinking that she might die. And then people say, well, when she did die, he didn't rush to her bedside. He was already 70 or something when he was at that age. So, I mean, he's not going to rush around anywhere at that sort of age. So I think it's a bit unfair on him. But people had us interested in that. So Tacitus describes Livia Drusilla in two ways, as this sort of powerful vixen of a lady machinating in the darkness and making things happen so they favor her and possibly her son Tiberius. And then when she dies, literally turn the page and then you read the next book, the first chapter of the new book, I think it's book 5, I think it is, maybe 6. Well, in the annals, then he goes into this obituary and says, actually, she was a woman of the old kind, a very, very fine, upstanding lady that represented true Roman values and solid. And so, what that means is that in the telling of the story, it suited Tacitus to be able to make her a villainess. And then when she dies...
Sorry for interrupting you, but you brought me onto an excellent question I just thought of. Is Tacitus about Livia, where he got graves to the idea that she poisoned and she is the villain of I Claudius? Is Tacitus' main source for Livia as the main villain in the novel?
So look at it. I'll mention one thing. I mentioned Calpurnius Piso Germanicus, the alleged poisoning. Plancina was the wife of Piso that we just alluded to, and she supposedly enlisted the help of a lady that knew about toxins and poisons, and apparently so did Livia, later the Augusta. Well, interestingly enough, Tacitus makes the comment that basically, I actually don't believe the rumors. I don't think they're true. And when you read other sources like Josephus and Suetonius, they talk about the discoloration of the body of Germanicus, and Josephus seems to think, well, they looked at the heart, and when they burned the corpse in the marketplace at Antiochia on the Orontes, the heart didn't burn, and that's a telltale sign of being poisoned, of course. So there's a sort of mythology that brews up. Candidly, I don't think it's possible. So look at the people. So somehow or other, she might have been involved in bumping off Marcellus, who was Augustus's nephew by his sister Octavia. Not likely. He'd been with Tiberius, incidentally, over in the Cantabrian Asturian War in the sort of 25-26 period, I think it was. And Augustus himself was sick. We think it was typhus. We're not quite sure what it was. He had to withdraw all the way down to Carthago Nova, or to one of the Tarragona, I think it was, Tarraco, where he was saved by his doctor. And it's quite possible that he died of one of those related conditions, having never fully recovered when he went back to Rome. And you've got to remember that a lot of things that Romans would interpret as being poison, right, were actually just down to diseases. Either they couldn't identify the diseases, they didn't have the cure for the diseases. My own particular explanation of how Germanicus died is that he had been in Egypt the previous season, actually being very naughty because he wasn't supposed to be there. You're supposed to ask permission of the emperor, in this case Tiberius. He didn't. that elicited a swift reprimand, which, by the way, he didn't get till he got back. But in the meantime, he could have picked up things on his travels, and then apparently there was several days when he was. Well, it could be, but here's the other thing. Here's the other dimension, right? So Roman medicine is using herbs and minerals and grinding them and so on insect parts and parts of bodies and all sorts, right? And it's predicated on your knowledge of those those pieces you put in there, the components. What if the doctor got the dosage wrong? Didn't understand that the strength of something grown in Syria was stronger than, let's say, in Italy. So in other words, he may have actually inadvertently have poisoned the patient himself. That sometimes the cure is worse than the disease is actually a Roman saying. So there are all these sort of questions. So that the leap to think that people were being routinely poisoned and it's very convenient to go blame Livia, I think is misdirected. I think it's very, very convenient from the point of view everybody wants to have an answer, right, to something. And it's very unsatisfying to think that Marcellus died of disease, Caius Caesar, Lucius Caesar, one died of a wound, one seemed to die of something. I think it was, again, he might have been a disease when he was coming back from Spain. And then we have Germanicus, I've explained that one. And there could be other members of the family who are being put up to all sorts of crimes and so on. The only one I would say that maybe has a legitimate linkage between the death of an individual and Livia, and by the way, not Tiberius, is probably Agrippa Posthumus. He was actually the son born last after Agrippa had died in 12 BC. So he was called Posthumus by history. In fact, his name was Agrippa, Marcus Agrippa, the same as his father. And he was adopted into the family at the same time as Tiberius. And I think this was, if I've got this right, I think it's 4 AD, I think. And the point was, in the line of succession that Augustus worked out, he got Tiberius to adopt Germanicus first, and then on the same day adopted both Agrippa, the posthumous son of Agrippa, and Tiberius the same. What he had done was basically created a line of succession. It was like 2 layers deep and 1 across. And the advantage of that was that he had some sense of surety that the statistically one at least should survive. The hope was it would end up with Germanicus as being the Caesar, the Augustus at the end of it. But he was to die after Augustus, as we know. But in that point, in 14 September roundabout, when Augustus dies and Tiberius is going to be picked and given the honors by the Senate, then this Agrippa is killed. And Tiberius denied it. It's quite possible that in that maelstrom of unknowing, the centurion that was given the order to kill him on his island, I think it was Pandataria, I think it was, maybe was jumping the gun and actually had actually killed him without authority. The tribune that went to the Senate basically said, well, I was following orders effectively. Tiberius denies ever issued the orders, but that order may have been given by Augustus and then transmitted through Livia. We don't know. That seems to be realistic because the last thing you want is a usurper at that sort of very, very tricky point of a handover. You've got to remember that when Augustus died, there was no process for someone to become princeps. We tend to think of it as being a bit presidential in the American sense that, one goes over and then there's a process and off it goes. That was not at all the case. There was a great deal of uncertainty. The first thing that Tiberius does when he finds Augustus dead is to send out the password to the Praetorian cohorts. They send out messages to all the legionary commanders and the legates of each of the provinces and say, the emperor is dead, well, the princeps is dead, wait for orders. There isn't a communique which says, I'm in charge now. He doesn't do that at all. What he does is to arrange the funeral. They go back to Rome with the body under great ceremony and pomp, and it's a great occasion. And when the Senate basically says, about being princeps, Tiberius, you're going to be it, aren't you? You're going to be the Augustus. He's furious. He says, no, we're going to deal with the affair of burying the late Augustus. That's the priority. And it takes several sessions of the Senate and several days before finally, over a protracted negotiation, Tiberius actually accepts the role of being princeps.
Maybe some old. It's almost like, I don't know if you've seen the movie The Death of Stalin, but it's almost like that scenario when they try to fight now in the movie when Khrushchev is who is trying to take over after Stalin's death. It almost sounds like it was that kind of scenario that oh no, we need to focus on Stalin right now. It's just Augustus. Instead, it's Augustus to do. I don't know if there's a good comparison or not, but it's almost quite little bit similar to that movie scenario. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I know very little, and I about your knowledge on that. There's some very good histories and biographies of Stalin out there.
I mean, the movie, The Death of Stalin. If you've seen it, it's
I'm gonna look. But I think that there's a little bit of a misunderstanding in the idea that somehow it was just automatic. Fill the form here, off you go. You're now emperor. That's not how it was at all. And in this really interesting constitutional experiment, it wasn't at all clear what would happen. There was a real risk. A lot of the Senate was worried that there might be a new civil war. They didn't want one, clearly. Some of these senators were the survivors of the previous civil war. They're quite old men. And they were now establishing their families, and those families were now putting their sons into positions of government, hoping to move forward in the new way of things. And Tiberius makes it quite clear, if you read the accounts of Velleius Paterculus and Tacitus, for example, and Cassius Dio, he basically says, really, this job is too big for one man. I propose that we divide it into three parts. And one will look after Italy, and one will look after this, the other will look at the outer provinces. And he gets some pushback from the Senate. One of these people, I think it's Asinius Gallus, I think he basically says, well, which one do you want, Caesar? And he gets a bit annoyed about this. And he said, look, the man who makes the decision to divide shouldn't be the one who chooses which parts. But anyway, so effectively, there is this pushing and negotiating. In my book, I describe it really as much as not a power grab by Tiberius so much as a negotiation. I genuinely think that when he made the point to the Senate, look, at any time you want me to retire, I will go. Right? I would quite like the quiet life. In fact, he'd already been to Rhodes, sort of 20 years before. So, my reading of his personality was he was a loyal servant to Augustus. He was given the last orders, which were basically, I need you to kind of guide this through to the next phase. And he takes that sort of as a command, but he really doesn't want it. I'm not using the word reluctant because he did what he did to the best of his ability. If he was reluctant, he would have just, so please yourself, but he didn't do that. And
even in the fair, I think we discussed this in our episode as well when we discussed our Julio-Claudian dynasty two-parter. That Tiberius was the man who liked to. He was a soldier. He liked a soldier's life. He liked being on the battlefield. He wasn't a senator. He wasn't a politician. He preferred,
But you know where else he was?
On the front.
But you know where else he was? He was a writer of poetry. He was an astrologer, a collector of art.
Yeah.
And what he wanted basically was some retirement. So, he tried that for 10 years. I mean, just interesting enough, this last year, the Domus Tiberiana has opened up again in Rome. You can actually go visit that. It's actually not Tiberius's building. It's actually Hadrianic and Neronian. It's got other periods in it. But the genesis of the building was his original palace. And he decided that it didn't give him enough privacy, so he decided to take more trips away from Rome, and he was encouraged in this by Sejanus, his Praetorian Guard commander, and ultimately he chose to go to Capri, where there were so many villas, like 11 or 12 of them, but in fact they were built, from what we can work out, by Augustus. So Augustus saw Capri as a place to escape. What's fascinating, though, it's not like he went there and had a quiet life. And in fact, I think if you read Plutarch, he actually makes this comment, which is if you thought, or he thought he was going to go there and just basically kick back and enjoy retirement, he was to be sorely disappointed, because in fact, he gets this constant stream of correspondence, constant stream of guests. I mean, there's a reason why the Villa Jovis is actually on the side of the island, which actually looks across to the Bay of Naples to Misenum. You can see the navy boats coming over, and they'll know there's a new message, right? They have a lighthouse, a pharos, just on the corner of the Villa Jovis. This huge, big 8-story building, which is still there as a ruin and absolutely fascinating to visit. So, this idea that he was a recluse and disconnected and not at all interested, that defies the facts as we know them. He was constantly writing, and in fact, he didn't just stay on the island. He went back to the Italian mainland, to Campania, even to the outskirts of Rome numerous times. He didn't go to Rome, and I suspect, I'm going to throw a little bit of modern interpretation, he got rather used to the idea that remote working, right, working from home, suited him. And what that meant was he had his little cadre, a little concilium, his little group of friends who were into law, and they were into politics and stuff like that. And of course, Thrasyllus, his astrologer friend, and between them they could cast charts and do all this sort of thing, which sounds very strange to modern eyes and ears, but Romans engaged and indulged in astronomy. And I draw the analogy to this. Astrology was probably to Tiberius what looking at financial forecasts and playing with Excel spreadsheets was like to a CEO or a CFO.
Was he a Libra or was he a Virgo?
What was what, sorry?
Was he a Libra or was he a Virgo?
Oh, no. Well, here's the interesting thing. So here's the interesting thing. If you read, so there are 3 texts of Roman astrologers that survive, right? 3 texts. And they put him down, as I recall, as a Scorpio. But here's the interesting thing. One of the texts one of the texts alludes to him as being, I think, a Libran. Is that the one before? And the point here's the point: is that you can be a Scorpio in the 12 sign zodiac, but under the 13 sign zodiac, which is the one that was more prevalent in the previous centuries, where there was another character who's now dropped out. We don't refer to this 13th sign anymore. That would make him a different sign. So if you think about him as being a Scorpio, well, you can read the horoscope things and you can see that, generally speaking, they can be a bit cruel and sort of clear-headed and what have you. So you can craft a sort of biographical story of a Tiberius who is the archetypal Scorpion. On the other hand, you could say, well, under this other older 13 sign horoscope system, the zodiac, in fact, he's a little bit more ambivalent. He doesn't make his mind up. He can be quixotic and this sort of thing, which also is part of the personality we see. He's accused of not being very decisive. My point is that, you see, he had only one role model to follow, and that was Augustus. Right? He was the guy that he had to look to in order to understand how to run the Roman Empire. And of course, Augustus was learning as he was going along, right? So one of the ways that Tiberius was able to get the Senate to work with him was to say, first of all, absolutely, you must sign up to this. You must agree that the laws of the Divus Augustus, the deified Augustus, are absolute. You will follow them and you will act with them, and that becomes the bedrock of everything we do. And that's what you see him in the court cases over and over and over again. He's constantly going back to what would the divine deified Augustus have done. And some people.
I don't want to interrupt you, but if you wouldn't mind, just keep talking. I just got to go to the bathroom real quick. I'm embarrassed by this, but if you wouldn't mind, keep entertaining us. I'll be right back. This is live, so I'm so sorry about this. I'm embarrassed myself, but I'll be right back if you wouldn't mind entertaining.
You can edit that part out and just make sure you keep the door closed.
This is live, so I can't edit this. So if you wouldn't mind, to keep talking.
I will.
I'll be right back, and I'll let you know when I'll be 2 minutes.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So you add all of these things up, and what you get is someone that's trying to make sense, not of a bad situation, but of a situation that's not of his own making, within this stricture of Roman law. There are rules and regulations over what magistrates do and what their terms of service and so on and so forth are. And then there's a wider international context with the border with Parthia and the Rhine-Danube with the Greater Germany, where there'd been, of course, problems and continued to be problems. And he had to manage within those confines. And, the historians writing after this had the benefit of 50, 100, 150 years more history to be able to see how this situation evolved. So someone like Cassius Dio could write at the time of the Emperor Caracalla, I think he was writing in the 220s, that that effectively what he was dealing with was a Roman monarchy system. And
I'm back.
okay.
I'm gonna do what I'm gonna do. What can I say?
Yeah, so I was just sort of picking up the theme that the historians that we've got are writing with the benefit of hindsight somewhat. And if you were actually living at the time of Tiberius, the only hindsight you had was what Augustus had been doing, and for him that was learn as you go. So by the time you get to Tacitus, for example, who's writing around just after the time of the Flavians, so really Nerva, he has seen several emperors come and go. He's seen a civil war. He's seen struggles, in Dacia as Trajan's going out there, and so on. And Suetonius, of course, writing at the time of Hadrian, knows what happens in the early years of Hadrian's reign. When the collapsing of the empire into the Euphrates, and so on and so forth. So these people are seeing the Julio-Claudians very much with the benefit of those additional years. And I think what comes out of it, if you read, for example, Suetonius, Augustus comes out as actually a very fine, upstanding figure. I think there's a reason why he is written very completely in that regard, although in fact Suetonius starts with the Divus Julius. He starts with him, even though we don't think of Julius Caesar as being an emperor. And then when you look at, for example, Cassius Dio, who was writing in the 200s, he's coming out from a totally different place. He, in fact, is a provincial who becomes a senator. So whereas the other ones are Italians, who are closer to Rome in terms of its history and its culture, this is a man from Asia who's very proud of being a senator, believes the Senate has a particular role to play, and don't like particularly those prominent figures like, for example, Tiberius and Nero and others who are demeaning to the Senate. So they're writing in a way critically because of that.
Something I want to move on from Tiberius very soon, but before I think we discussed this in a 2-part series on Tiberius and Julio-Claudian last year. But let's talk about the murdering and the murder spree that Tiberius supposed to do. And again, I want to bring up that we did it from the very start of the stream, where we discussed the Tom Holland's Dynasty, for example, which is behind me on my bookshelf up here. But he seemed to believe generally that Tiberius, or I don't know if this is just because it's a general history that it's for public, because that's what they want to read about, how crazy Tiberius murdered all these senators. But let's talk about, did he really have all these sexual orgies and make Caligula watch the senators murder? Make Caligula have all these sexual orgies and watch other people, sex workers, and have all these orgies together and enjoy them and murdering of the senators. Was it that kind of, because like we said earlier, he was more a poet, he was more a warrior, he was a man on the front line in this just poetry. But so it doesn't seem like it was plausible to me that he had all these sexual orgies, or that he had, made Caligula have all these weird sex things, fetishes that supposedly Tiberius had. Again, it seemed like it was anti-Julio-Claudian propaganda that seemed to be. And now I'm repeating a lot of this, that is always anti-Julio-Claudian propaganda, etc., etc. But what are your thoughts on this?
So the first thing, I don't believe for a second all of these outlandish claims of all these murders. And in fact, if you read J.P. Sutherland, and there's a statement in there, it's over my shoulder, I don't have access to it right now, where basically someone did an analysis of all of the cases involving majestas, which is basically treason. It basically means majesty, as in crimes against the majesty of the Roman people. We now call it treason. Where basically there are something like 50 cases, and actually between the dismissal of the offences, between the pardons, between the not guilties, I think it only works out to be about 12 people actually die. So you need to understand the context. When you read a lot of these cases, and by the way, they get more and more bizarre. When I was actually writing the final chapter of my book, I thought, are these people completely nuts? Because they were all starting to accuse each other. It wasn't Tiberius accusing it. It was the senators pointing fingers at each other. And it came to a crescendo, by the way, with the death of Sejanus, or Sejanus, in part because that they were shocked into the fact that they had been manipulated, and this man was, sort of pushing people that he liked in front. But there had been people who'd been collaborators, and the collaborators were being called out to account. And their death sentences were not actually pushed by Tiberius. It was actually fellow senators. So I want to make that point first. That was a big surprise to me, by the way. So there's a lot less blood actually happening in the reign of Tiberius than you might read in some of the accounts, and certainly in Tacitus, on the face of it. The other side is interesting. So look, there is a Roman concept in rhetoric. It's called vituperatio. With the modern English word is vituperation. Think of it as character assassination. In rhetoric, in the Roman style of when you're actually attacking someone, you come out with all these outlandish things. You can go back to Julius Caesar having been accused of sleeping with Nicomedes, right, as being his bedfellow. Marcus Antonius, for example, was accused of doing outlandish things by the man that we call Augustus, as indeed was Augustus called by Marcus Antonius. So this is part of Roman rhetoric. It's the idea that you make fun of by throwing mud, I could say worse things, at the character in the hope that some of it sticks to get a guilty verdict. So in the storytelling, people like Tacitus and Cassius Dio are writing a rhetorical in the tradition of rhetoric. Now, about the sexual allegations, Edward Champlin, a very great historian, I think he's up in one of the universities in Canada, I think, has written a series of papers, one of which is about this very subject. And he goes back to the accounts of, but it's Tacitus and it's Suetonius that really talk about these famous spintriae and these other performers. And he actually says our translation of those words is wrong. I don't quite remember what the translations are, but they're different translations. But he puts the whole activity within the wider context of what's going on in Campania. Anybody that's gone to Herculaneum or Stabia or Aplontis or Herculaneum Pompeii area and seen the wall paintings sees profuse nudity, sees profuse sexual cavorting. There's some very famous ones. And in fact, there was a part of the Naples Archaeological Museum where for years it was locked up. You weren't allowed to go in there. And now I think they've taken a rather more open-minded approach. So the idea of sexuality as being much more open, not necessarily in the public view, but open, is something I think we underestimate. Where Tiberius has built his Villa Jovis.
To be fair, even in ancient time, men and women had sexual urges, and today even you and I have sexual urges. That it's a human thing to have all these sexual urges that have. That we need to let out.
But I think the stories that are described of Tiberius push them to a form of excess.
Yeah.
Right. So the stories they're ones about pools and young boys and so on and so forth as minnows, right? Now there's another way you can look at this. There's a very different way you can look at this, and which within the context of Roman life in Campania. So there was a place called Baiae, it was in Roman times, which wasn't a town. It was like a sort of summer resort where all the rich and famous had villas. They had their own quays on the sea, so their boats could come directly. There was no forum. There were no public buildings. It was basically a collection of very high class villas. And actually, Nero actually was able to finagle Calpurnius Piso, one of the man we talked about had sons. One of those descendants owned a villa there, and in fact, Nero arranged to have him basically bumped off when he was implicated in an assassination attempt, so he could take the palace, right? And Baiae has been found. There's ruins of it going right out to the. What they point to is what you read about in the Roman accounts is this life of excess. It's a party town. People go there to have wild parties, to drink excessively, to do things that don't go on in Rome. It's sort of Las Vegas, a Roman Las Vegas. So Tiberius decided he didn't build a villa in that area in Baiae. He did have one at Spelunca, by the way, not very far away, which is famous because it has a grotto, a cave, which is associated with Augustus. So you can actually go to the villa at Spelunca and you can see the remains. But he decided after a while that he was actually going to go to Capri. It was the ultimate in getting away from it all. But he chose who came. And in fact, he didn't live alone at all. the estimates of people living in the village Ovis is something around about 250, 300 people, of whom about 150 of those were slaves, servants, freedmen doing work, because it was a functional palace, and there were gardens, and they had to grow food and so on and so forth, and there were guests coming in. He had a chief that looked after his library in Greek and Latin, and all sorts of things there. So did he engage in those parties? Let's remember, he is in his late 60s, going into his 70s. It's possible.
I think we said this, but he was actually older than Augustus, wasn't he?
Yes, he died. He was a year or two older when he died.
So it's, I mean, I don't see myself partying and joining such orgies when I was 60. I mean, I'm turning 30 next month, and I don't see myself going to like a nightclub in this age. You know what I'm saying?
No, but imagine this though. Imagine this: if you could do something without consequences.
I mean, I wouldn't mind an orgy, to be fair.
No. So the way that I want to go back to Edward Champlin, the way he describes it, which makes a lot of sense to me, is that there would have been. So he would enjoy retelling stories from mythology, right? I mean, the Greek and Roman stories of mythology, there's lots of sex in them. Yeah. So he could actually have a stage where these things could be acted out, and they could be beautifully done with clouds, just like a sort of almost like a 16th, 17th century French masque, those famous ballets that they used to have. And again, the clues for that come in the wall paintings over in Pompeii and Herculaneum. You can see the way they did those wonderful trompe-l'oeil architectural things. You can imagine that evoked in a stage. And sex may have been displayed because, that we know, I think Vitellius, I think is one of the people as a young man involved in that, because I think when you read Suetonius about Vitellius, you'll find there's a reference to it. So what was interesting is that Tiberius treated them as prostitutes, as lowlifes, right? And they were paid to do this job, so they were actors in this way. And actors anyway were treated as lowlifes, even if they were just doing Greek tragedies or Roman pantomimes. So I'm at this position, having done all the research. I think it's quite feasible that they were sexually explicit displays going on, but they were within the context of telling a bit like what they call those tableaux, right? They were sort of dramatic, sort of visual things, and he could be eating things. So in other words, he could have been a voyeur, if you like. His guests might have been involved, and afterwards, there would be lots of pretty young people, and someone like a young teenage Caligula, as we now call him, may well have actually taken advantage of that. And oh, by the way, it wasn't invented by Tiberius. There was a man in the 50s BC that was notorious for doing these. I think they basically called them like temporary brothels. And it was a thing that rich clients could do to have their friends over, and they could bring in a couple of prostitutes, and they could do this sort of thing. I think that because we come from a different tradition.
That's not too far off what Wall Street people are doing today, though.
Money. Money and access, power. I think the one thing that struck me also was that Tiberius was probably 100% heterosexual. He had loved completely one woman whose name was Vipsania, Agrippina. Yeah. And when he was told that he had to divorce her to marry Julia, who was Augustus's daughter after Marcus Agrippa had died, he was bereft. I think that impacted him in a way that probably fundamentally changed him, because that was a soulmate, and I think that must have hurt tremendously. There's no evidence that he was ever interested in other women after that. As soon as Julia gave birth to a stillborn child, he basically abandoned her. He went off on campaign. He did military stuff, and she stayed in Rome. And that's where
wasn't Tiberius married second time that she had that I don't remember. I think it was Julia. I think I'm not quite certain the name, but that's the one that had so many affairs.
Yes,
and yeah, ended up exiling her. Again, I don't remember her name, but I just remember that
Julia. Her name was Julia. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about that, we call her Julia Major, by the way, Julia the Elder. The interesting thing there is that Tiberius by this time is away in Rhodes. This all happens while he's in Rhodes, and in fact tries to vouch for her. He said, "Look, I understand that she is your daughter, Augustus, so please be a kind father to her. Of course, Augustus was enraged. He basically banished her to Pandateria. And what's interesting is that she was exiled there with her mother. Her mother decided to go willingly to be with her daughter, so life was tough. But later she was allowed to go back to Rhegium on the mainland, and again had a fairly austere life. And under Tiberius, when the will was read out, in a sort of cruel twist, because Augustus has stipulated that Julia should not be allowed to be buried in his mausoleum. Oh, by the way, her pension will be cut off now too. So she, in fact, found herself with no money coming in anymore. And Tiberius, of course, executed that. And within a year or two, Julia was dead and not buried in the mausoleum, but I think was actually buried in Rhegium. Sad story.
Now, we don't want to end this. I wanted to talk a little bit about Caligula, of course, or a little bit. And let's talk about what are your thoughts, because it seems like some historians today, and this in public history, trying to, and it seems to be quite a modern thing that are trying to rehabilitate some emperors, for example, like Nero or Caligula. And what are your thoughts on this, on rehabilitating such emperors? And was because and again it comes, because it's always come back to this later propaganda things. How much of this is propaganda and how much of is actually true? Like how was Caligula real? And again, it doesn't seem that it's implausible coming from the background that his entire family was pretty much murdered under the reign of Tiberius, and he felt like a prisoner under Tiberius, and it doesn't seem too implausible that anyone would probably get crazy from feeling this way. But what are your thoughts on Caligula, and how was really this mad emperor that people claim him to be, and how do you feel about rehabilitating such emperors as Nero or perhaps Caligula?
So rehabilitation, that's an interesting word, but we'll come back to that. I've been very influenced by Alois Winterling's book, Caligula, a biography, and it's quite a short book, but it's very thought-provoking. And one of the lines of inquiry he has is about the insanity argument. And what I recall from reading his book is that actually, once again, you can see, just as it did with Tiberius, there are sort of phasings. During his life, people didn't call him insane like he's a guy who's lost his marbles or is just crazy. They thought his behavior was strange, exaggerated in ways, but he wasn't mad. In fact, what's very interesting is he was actually very popular, particularly with the plebeians, laying on entertainments and so on and so forth. The people who really felt very uneasy with him were, of course, the so-called elites, the patricians, the very same people who didn't like Tiberius, incidentally, or anything else in the Principate.
I mean, the fact that a lot of the history of the senators that were around Caligula and say Nero as well, to use another example.
Yes,
and they didn't like, because Caligula were well loved by the public, as we know.
Yeah.
But because he rubbed some senators off the wrong foot, and Nero as well.
Yeah. In fact,
they are the ones who write the propaganda, write the history of Caligula and Nero, because they. So can we really rely on those sources, and how, and was it how again it comes to propaganda of how just because the senators who wanted to enrich themselves, in a way, to put it that way, it's really fair to use fair on Caligula himself.
So everything I said about Tiberius and the sources applies equally to Caligula. One of the things that I'm fascinated by, again, I think earlier I mentioned Philo of Alexandria. He was part of an embassy that was trying to appeal to Caligula for help. And Philo, actually, being a Jew, and a provincial, actually was taken to the palace and actually met Caligula face to face. So we actually have a record that he writes in the first person of what that encounter was like. And you can imagine he was very anxious because he's going to meet, the princeps, the the head of the Roman world, and only one opportunity to make a first impression. And the thing that I recall are two things. One, Caligula is actually distracted because he's choosing decorations for his home. He wants sparkly things. I want that jewel a bit higher. No, the blue one, the green one over there. Right? So Caligula is making a house, and he's worrying about interior decoration. And very anxiously, of course, they're not quite sure, because I dare say there's a certain element of they've been briefed by the chief freedman at the door, don't look at his eyes, keep your head low, they're working this way. On the other hand, don't call him this because. So he must have been very conscious, in the same way that someone visiting the king in England, right, is told before they go, do this, do that, and call him Your Majesty. This is the protocol. So they get into this awkward conversation. And one of the things that I remember is that Caligula says, "Oh, you're Jewish. What's this thing with not eating pigs?" And as I recall, what's the deal with the pigs? And I think the line is something like, they're not a sort of very clean or attractive animal. Oh, I quite agree with you on that. So you can almost imagine, just because Caligula's always been in these somewhat...
The girls would agree with the pig thing.
Yeah.
But the girls disagree with the girls thing, with the pig things.
Yeah. But my point is that you get a really interesting glimpse into what a real unprepared encounter with Caligula was like. I don't even think they got to discuss the matter what Philo and his embassy got to do, because he went back to picking his decorations. But the point is, he came over as being someone who had curiosity. He had sort of like a superficial knowledge of something, and he kind of asked a question. He wasn't cruel in the sense of get out of my way, provincial. He didn't say anything like that. So what does that tell you? Well, I think that when you read Suetonius, who by that part in his book, he's got this sort of litany of things he wants to talk about, the history of the family.
I mean, to be fair, we have this scene, and I don't know how reliable this is, but you have a scene where he supposedly stand behind his wife and says, "Off goes the hand if the emperor wishes to."
But he probably had a wicked sense of humor. Tiberius was accused of the similar sort of thing, where at a banquet, I think it was the other Agrippina was warned. That was the former wife of Germanicus was warned. Yes, there you go. That the food may have been poisoned, so just be very careful. And when she's given this fruit, she looks and doesn't know what to do with it. And there's a comment from, I think, Tiberius along the lines, well, gosh, if I wanted to kill you, I'd have killed you in a much easier way than that. And I think it's just a dark sense of humor. So Tiberius liked to quote lines from Greek tragedies to show he knew.
Like the horse scene.
Yes. So I think what happens is somebody hears it and says, "Oh my God, he said that," and they take it in a sort of literal sense, but they don't convey that, oh, by the way, he winked, or there was a manner in which he said, because he's basically being very flippant, or he was half drunk, because Tiberius liked to drink, as you may know. And in the case of Caligula, I mean, he'd grown up in that environment, right? So his schooling, as such as it was, his schooling was not like Tiberius or his brother or Augustus, which was to say that he had a rhetorician and, people who taught him about the world and so on. No, Caligula had a much more sheltered view. In fact, he, if you remember, was up with Germanicus at the time of 14 when the mutiny took place. And in fact, was the hero of the guardsmen, the soldiers. And in fact, when the mutiny came to a head, basically Germanicus uses the ploy. Okay, well, my son's going with the Gallic cavalry now because we can't trust you. And at that point, the mutiny falls apart because they can't be without their little boots, their Caligula, who's their mascot effectively. So at that point, they realize, what are we doing? This is crazy. We need to stop this mutiny, amongst other things. So. For a young man growing up in that sort of world, it seems a little bit topsy-turvy. And the Romans, when they're writing the history, are fascinated like we are in what goes on in the palace. The sort of the oddities of things that, these people have so much power but do crazy things. And Mary Beard wrote this, by the way, about Elagabalus. She made that point.
It's not a tabloid newspaper in a way.
In some regards, and I think that's right. It's an assemblage of facts, and witty stories. But occasionally, you've got to be careful of the phrases, which is, "It is said that," "people say," "Oh, rumor was spreading
Then
that."
one feather, and then she loses another, and then she loses another as the story goes on.
Yes, exactly. So, so when you're reading these sources, I think, and this is the message I want to leave the viewers and the listeners with, is that when you're reading the original sources in translation, just bear in mind that, first of all, the translator themselves makes judgments about how they make the translation. If you're lucky to read it in the original Latin, then you will see much more obviously the use of the language, and the way that, as I said, like they use expressions like "it is reported that," which is effectively saying rumors say. And a lot of, when someone says to you, "A lot of people are saying," does that make it a fact?
Yeah. And I think we're gonna write it up there. Before you go, do you have any social media you want to share with us, or do you have where do people buy your books? Which you absolutely should. And when it's Tiberius,
Okay. Yes.
which we will make an episode about when it comes out.
Super.
Where can people find you if they have further questions about Julio-Claudian history or what we discussed today? And of course, anything else you want to share with the wider public.
So I have a swanky new website, which is Lindsay, Lindsay-Powell, Powell.com, Lindsay-Powell.com. And on there are links to the leading, or I think of being great bookstores online, or bricks and mortar ones you can find. You can find articles I've done, podcasts I've done with the History Network, and all sorts of really interesting stuff, including a recording of me with the local radio station here in Austin, which was great fun. I'm on X as at Lindsay_Powell.
Twitter, not X.
Okay. Yes. And then I'm also on Facebook. If you look for Lindsay Powell author, you'll find me on there. So I post every day, at least 3 or 4 times on Twitter/X. I post most days on Facebook, and I update my website quite frequently. And I welcome contact with people. I know a lot of people think social media is an awful and miserable place. I tell you what's interesting is,
to be honest though, and Facebook is insufferable these days, and I'm really not a fan of Facebook anymore. I'm more on X/Twitter these days.
Well, if you follow me at Lindsay Powell author on Facebook, I actually take some of the most hilarious of the AI generated images and I try and crack a joke. And actually, there's some of the favorite things that apparently people like about what I post. But I was going to say about X or Twitter is the fact that there are groups of us that talk about ancient history in a very broad sense, and we're very civil. We like to engage with people. You learn a lot, and in fact, I have to say that sometimes I have questions about a thing I've seen, and that person will go back and say, "Yes, here's the source," or "That's where I found it," or "Here's another one you didn't know about." And in fact, it can be very educational. So find me, look at the people I follow, and look at the people I interact with, and I think you'll actually have a good experience of social media.
Thank you so much again for doing this live stream. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you. This has been With That H12. You can find us on social media on Twitter/X and the With That H12. We are also available on Instagram under With That H12. We are available on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts. I will try to make a live stream once a month. Next month, we will try to have a Halloween special coming out with Danny Bush. That will be a lot of fun. We talk about witches and Halloween in general. And next week we celebrate the 200th episode with a drunk medieval history. So that will be a lot of fun. So stay tuned and subscribe and leave a comment or whatever you do on the social media these days. My name is Alan. I'm going to end the live stream now if I can find it. There you go. There's the mouse. And thank you so much. That's what she said. And thank you so much for tuning in. It's been a great pleasure and great fun to do this live stream with you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Erlend. Anytime.
And I'll see you next time.